I really like making terrain. It gives you a chance to use some different skills that you don't normally use, mix in some craft skills, build something from the ground up. What I don't like, however, is having local players destroy the terrain right after you make it, which happens quite often. Don't know why they do that. So I've been on a quest to build more durable terrain, and this time I'm building some trees. Now there's a goal here. We need to make this strong and durable. We need to do it cheap because I know eventually, no matter how strong I make it, it's going to get ripped apart. And also, I am making trees, but I decided I wanted to take some gigantic trees, some redwood Endor forest type of trees. So that's what we're doing here. And to start off, we are beginning with some wire. I got this from the hardware store. This is 16 gauge. And you can get a big spool of it for just a couple bucks. And I'm just cutting off roughly about 10-inch lengths here. Taking roughly half a dozen of these now straightened wires, I'm not proceeding to wrap them with additional wire. Thinner wire, this is actually stem wire for doing floral work. Pretty much anything will work, just make it thin, pliable, so we can easily wrap it up. Some of these trees that I'm making, I'm not wrapping up all 6 branches at the same time. Some of them I'm leaving a few, halfway down the trunk of the tree that we're building, or I may add more after wrapping up this initial 6, add a few extra branches here and there. So I'm not just wrapping once here, I'm wrapping repeatedly as needed. After your trunk is all wrapped up, you could start bending the wires into somewhat more of a tree shape with the roots and the branches. Now I'm going to add some smaller branches. Once again, going with the stem wire, just using some scrap wire bits and wrapping the stem wire around repeatedly and leaving 2 extended sides. So I'm getting, from one branch, I'm adding 2 more smaller branches to it. You can do this on the branches themselves, but I found it a bit easier to do it with the scrap piece and then slide them on afterwards. I'm attaching the smaller branches using a hot glue gun, and feel free to be liberal at this point because hot glue is really cheap. So put gobs of it on. I also put some down the trunk to adhere, hold the wires together a bit better, and also where I added some extra larger branches. And all those little stringy bits of the hot glue, you can remove those by using a hairdryer. Works pretty well once you're all done. Next thing to do is to beef out our tree, and for that we are using aluminum foil. So just using a whole bunch of aluminum foil here and slowly thickening out the tree. Of course, we want a larger trunk, and the branches themselves will get less layers of the aluminum foil. Be careful because we do have little wire bits sticking out here and there, so you don't want to stab yourself. But keep building up as big as you want your tree, so there's really no limit as how large you can go. Just make sure the aluminum foil is fairly tightly packed. Now, here's where things get incredibly messy. First thing we want to do is put a whole bunch of newspapers down on your work area. And because what we're going to be doing now is using cloth mache, which is something I just heard about recently, and the main reason why I thought about building trees because I wanted to try this stuff out. Cloth mache is basically strips of cloth. What I used was paint rags I bought at the hardware store, which actually turned out to be just very cheap t-shirts that were all ripped up. And we're soaking those in a 50-50 mixture of white glue and water. So what you do is you cut your strips, you soak them, pull out for a few minutes or seconds, take the strips out, kind of squeeze out the excess glue and water mixture, and proceed to wrap it around all of our aluminum foiled up tree. Now, like I said, this is very messy here, and I learned a couple things doing this. First thing was that the type of cloth matters. I was using old t-shirts, and so some of the pattern did show through in the end results. I hear bed sheets work very well, so you can try that. Other thing I learned, you want to start with the branches and all the smaller things, and then work your way towards the trunk, and then do the trunk last so you have less excess bits kind of hanging off. And the most important thing I learned is that the small strips I'm using here tend to curl up when they're wet, and I did my best to kind of unfold all of those. And I think in hindsight that was a mistake. I should have left it rolled up a bit more, because the areas where I left it more rolled up, it actually looked better on the tree. It made the tree more gnarly and gave it more lumps, rather than the somewhat flat texture of just putting on the sheets as flat as I can. The other thing is, as you flatten them out, if you stretch out the cloth, the pattern tends to show up a bit more. So a couple different things, ways you can do this, but the main goal is to wrap up all the aluminum foil. And once all that's done, it's going to take about 24 to 48 hours for everything to dry. Once the tree is dry, you can attach it to your base. I am using 1/8 MDF, and once again using the hot glue gun. And notice I didn't put the wrapping all the way down to the bottom. I left the wires exposed so I get really good adhesion there. And once again, hot glue is cheap. Be liberal with it. Things got a little bit messy again at this stage. I should have covered the desk once again, but right now I'm trying to blend the tree into the base, and for that I'm using some Das Pronto air dry clay, and I've mixed it with a good amount of white glue to make it a bit more sticky, and it tends to adhere better once dry. And I'm just not trying to cover the whole base here, just trying to blend where the roots come down. I'm sure you can notice by now I'm trying to go for kind of a swampy type look where the roots are exposed somewhat. Mainly that's just because for gameplay purposes I wanted the base of the tree to provide a bit more cover, so I decided to do this. Now I did pre-treat the MDF with some sealant to prevent them from warping. However, after applying the clay they still warped quite a bit, so I had to go back, wet down the bases, and then clamp them to the table and let them dry overnight to straighten them out once again. So Das Pronto, it's pretty cheap, maybe not the best clay, but you can use something else, whatever suits your fancy. Now is the time to add our greenery, and I went with a fern plastic plant here because I figured that would look the most tree-like. You have a wide variety of options you can choose from, either silk plants or plastic. Just go to your local craft store and you'll find a whole bunch. I got these because they were pretty cheap, and they're going to be very, very durable. I think I used 2 bushels or 2 stems worth of these, and I think I got them off of eBay for like $2 each, so very low cost. But I'm now adding them to all the wires that we have sticking out on top, once again using the hot glue gun. This sticks very well to the very soft plastic of our fern branches here. Super glue or something like that would not adhere very well. Also, I want to mention at this point that even though the cloth mache has dry, you can still bend the branches around a little bit at this point to make small adjustments. The cloth mache is still a little bit malleable, and so you can change things up even at this stage. Speaking of which, if you decided you needed a few more branches here and there, you can actually use a drill and drill in to the tree. Just drill through the cloth and into the aluminum foil, and then using a small extra bit of wire you can stick in a branch here and there. It won't be as strong as the main branches, but if you feel that your tree needs an extra touch here and there, you can go ahead and do that. After adding some random gravel bits to the base of the tree and priming them, we can go ahead and start on the paint. Now, ideally, it would have been a lot easier if I could have used rattle cans to do all the primer and paint here, but unfortunately, the soft plastic leaves that I chose to use tend to react badly to propellants in cans. So I decided not to use those and go through the much more tedious task of using the airbrush. And for our first layer here, I'm using Reaper paints, mainly because I have a whole bunch and I never used them and I need a lot of paint to finish this up. So I'm starting off on the trunk with muddy brown, and yes, you're not going to be able to see much here because there's a giant tree in your way. Our next color is Reaper Leather Brown, and just adding some highlights to the trunk. And I'm trying to avoid using dry brushing or washes here because I was kind of worried that it would bring out the texture of the cloth, and which is something I did not want at this point. For our leaves, first of all, I did not prime the leaves. I just gave them a quick light dust coat because it would have taken forever trying to completely prime all of them by hand. So that was not necessary, but I am repainting them or just adding some color. Starting off once again with the Reaper paints using forest green, and also you see I'm using a bit of card to protect the trunk and to help paint each individual leaf so I don't miss anything underneath or above. Our next color is pale green, and applying this outwards towards the ends of all the fronds. So we're starting with a dark color, and as we go to the younger leaves up front, the color is going to start getting lighter. And then our last color is Reaper Sunlight Yellow, mixed with just a small amount of the previous pale green. And once again, working out towards from the center, so this is going on to the very ends of all the fronds. After that, we can go ahead and take care of the base. I dry brushed it with some random brown colors and also picked out all the rocks and the gravels with various grays. Now I'm applying a wetted down PVA glue and proceeding to add a whole bunch of bright green static grass, and trying not to cover the area underneath the tree because you figure that's going to get less sunlight, less chance of things to grow there. I decided I needed to punch up the tree just a little bit. It needed a bit more something, and I went with some moss just attached to the base underneath the tree. I believe this stuff is called fern moss, if I'm remembering correctly. I want to say peat moss, but I'm pretty sure that's not it. So let's go with fern moss, shall we? And just adding a few pieces here and there to the bottom of the tree just to spice things up a little bit. These pieces are probably not game table compatible. I'm sure they're probably going to get crushed and ripped off at some points, but well, they're there for now. Final thing to do is to seal everything down with some flat varnish, and once again would have been better to use a spray can, but because of the leaves, the soft plastic, I didn't want to risk that. Normally I do not recommend putting a varnish over static grass because Loose bits tend to fly off and get stuck where you don't want them, but this is terrain. It's going to get beaten up a lot more. So a nice thick heavy coat on the grass will help keep everything in place, and also a little bit on the tree itself. I think that's going to be pretty durable. You're not going to get paint scratching off a cloth. So I think that's pretty safe, but I did do a light coat overall. And there we are. There is our forest of giant trees. Up close, they won't win any beauty contests, but from afar, I think they came out pretty good. They look a little bit rough as you get closer. You can kind of start seeing the sock puppet texture. But once they're on the table with other terrain, I think they're going to work out pretty well. And this was a real experiment for me. I just heard about cloth mache. I wanted to see how other ways I can use it. So there's a lot of ways you can take this. As I said, you could use a thinner cloth. You can wrap it differently. You could bunch it up. The size of the trees, you can make different sizes here. You can do different fronds and what have you. I made more of a palm tree swamp hybrid here. You can make a more traditional tree if you like. But really, I think these are going to be very durable and be able to last on the table for quite a while. Should have made some smaller ones at least, I think, to match. But overall, pretty good success. I got enough to cover a fairly large table by making 5 trees. It was a long process, though. Took me about 3 weeks to do everything when you include all the dry time. So keep that in mind. A little messy, a bit time consuming, but you know what? I learned a new skill and I'm glad I did it. And follow along if you want to try something like this yourself. So as always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
Filmed in Wedgie Vision.